Well, hello, ISU. I am Dr. Sarah Roby. I am the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the History Department. And while we are all at home in self-isolation, I wanted to bring to you a little bit of kind of a get to know you of our history faculty members. And so today I'm pleased to be introducing Dr. Stango, who is one of our newer history faculty members. Dr. Stango, thanks for being here. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background?
Great. Thanks so much for introducing me. So I'm Dr. Stango. I joined the history department here at ISU in the fall, and I'm so glad to be here. I did my doctoral work at the University of Michigan, where I studied the histories of slavery and emancipation in the United States and in the Atlantic world broadly, so anywhere touching the sort of Atlantic basin, generally speaking. Right now, I'm continuing that research, and I'm working on a book that's looking at American colonization in Liberia. And Liberia is a nation in West Africa that was founded with support from US Congress, actually.
Right. So it has a very different history than a lot of African nations, right?
Exactly. And there's a lot of connections between the US and Liberia that still exist today. For instance, Thanksgiving celebrations. If you look at the Liberian flag, it looks a lot like our flag in the US.
Wow, so really cool connections there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history that I became interested in when I was in grad school. And so I'm really excited to continue to work on it.
Yeah, and I'm sure our students will be excited to kind of learn a little bit more about broader sort of international history, transnational history. They might know more about the American case, but to broaden it out, I think, is a real opportunity for a lot of our students. So. Well, I also wanted to ask you about what you were doing earlier this semester. So Dr. Stango was lucky enough to receive a National Endowment for the Humanities, an NEH grant. Could you tell us what you did with the grant?
Sure. So I was lucky enough to receive this grant to do research at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And if you have never heard of the Library Company of Philadelphia, think of it as Disneyland for early American scholars. So this was actually a library founded by Benjamin Franklin, right? So this goes way back into the 18th century. And it was a subscription library. So the members of the library company would pool together their money and be able to purchase books that individuals would not be able to purchase themselves. Over the centuries, Ben Franklin's library has transformed into a preeminent research library for scholars. So we go there and we look at really old, rare books. There's some other materials too as well, a lot of visual material, some manuscript collections, by which I mean handwritten documents. So it's a fabulous place. And Philadelphia is truly the center of early American studies. So you have not just the Library Company, but right next door, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which has some founding documents from early colonial history, actually through the 20th century.
It must have been so exciting to kind of do that hands-on research. Do you have any examples that you could show us of some things, cool things you found in the archives?
Yes, I can. So I have a few different things to share with you all. So let's start by looking at one of these images that actually comes to us from the Library Company of Philadelphia, where I was for most of the semester. What you're looking at is an image of a butterfly, and this is a painting done by a woman, Sarah Mapps Douglas. And Sarah Mapps Douglas was an African-American abolitionist, educator, artist. She really did a lot of things in her life, including painting this black butterfly that you're looking at.
Beautiful. It's really quite stunning. Yeah.
Yeah. So if any of my former students are looking at this image, they will have seen it before because I love to teach with this image. So this is artwork that is signed by an African-American woman artist. It's probably one of the first pieces of artwork done by an African-American woman artist to be signed. You know, one of the things that's really fascinating about this image, of course, is the sort of rationale behind it, right? We can sort of interpret this image in a lot of different ways. Black is beautiful being one of them, right? It's very intentional that she's portraying a black butterfly here. Yeah. And at the bottom it reads, the inscription at the bottom reads, "A token of love from me to thee, Sarah Maps Douglas." And that might give you some indication of where this image appeared. And it appeared in a friendship album. Oh. A friendship album is the 19th century term for a sort of scrapbook / yearbook. So back in the day when Dr. Roby and I were in school, at the end of the year, you would get a yearbook that your friends would sign and write little messages. And this is the same idea, that you would have your friends sign your album, maybe write a poem, maybe copy a piece of literature, or in this case, complete a beautiful watercolor painting. And this appears in the album of Amy Matilda Cassie, who was another elite free Black woman living in Philadelphia in the antebellum era.
Wow, that's really cool. So how would you use this in class? What would you use it to, aside from, you know, revealing that 19th century African-American women in Philadelphia also had yearbooks? What else does this tell us in terms of learning something about history?
Yeah. So what this album actually is a visible manifestation of relationship networks, right? So these abolitionist societies that we hear about and that we read about, real people formed these societies. And if you look at who signed Cassie's album or who inscribed things into it, they're leading abolitionists within Philadelphia and within the antebellum North, generally speaking. So historically, it allows us to understand the network, right, that pulled together these abolitionists within the North. The other thing that this album, I think, is really useful for is for giving us a really strong example of the possibilities for Black freedom in the antebellum period. So you have to remember that most white audiences, North and South in the United States, in the 1830s and 1840s, generally had very negative assumptions about African Americans. And so these kinds of sources produced by African Americans themselves gives us a sense of how these communities saw themselves, which is really important for understanding African American history, and it's really important for understanding United States history too.
Yeah, and I love it too because it makes these, you know, we call them historical actors in class, like it makes these people in history, you know, come alive and have more personality than just their role as activists or just, you know, the frames that we usually study them in. These were real people with hobbies and friends and really, you know, kind of dear, close networks of people. And yeah, when we think about placing ourselves in the shoes of people in the past, this helps us get a little closer to that. Do you have anything else to show us? Other kind of archival goodies?
Yeah, so I have something really cool to show you, and this is a daguerreotype. So daguerreotypes were the early version of photography. So people could sit for these portraits, these daguerreotypes, of course, if they had enough money to purchase them. It was not simply as easy as, you know, picking up your phone and taking a selfie today. Yeah. What you're looking at here is a daguerreotype done by Augustus Washington. And Augustus Washington was an African-American photographer. He attended Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, but then as an adult, he decided to move his photography studio to Liberia in West Africa. And while he was there, he took a series of daguerreotypes of African-Americans in Liberia, including the one that you're looking at here. So I love this image. I use it a lot in class to talk about Liberia and to talk about the role of African American women in the founding of Liberia and the sort of making of that nation. So even if you knew nothing about this woman from the outset, right, you could tell a few things about her, right? She's of middling class, at least. We can tell that by her dress, by the jewelry she wears, by the way she's actually holding the case in which this daguerreotype is enclosed, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
So she's presenting an image of refinement and respectability. And again, she's putting together an argument for respectability that's really counter to what a lot of white Americans think about African Americans in this time period, showing the capacity for citizenship, for participation in politics. She really encapsulates the idea of the refined woman in this image.
What would have something like this, where would have this ended up? Was this a photograph for her or for her family, or would it have been something that was shipped back to the United States? How did it end up too in the Library of Congress?
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. The fact that it is in the Library of Congress, right, indicates probably who the audience for this image was supposed to be. So a number of African Americans in Liberia, particularly among the elite, which this woman clearly was, sent back images, letters, copies of publications like newspapers to audiences in the United States. So they wanted Americans to see what they were accomplishing in Liberia. And in this case, it's a very visible reminder of what African Americans were accomplishing in Liberia. It's very possible that there were other copies of it that did remain with her family in Liberia as well. That's not uncommon, particularly for somebody of the social and economic standing of this woman. And I don't actually know for sure who this woman is, which is why I keep calling her this woman. She's probably a member of the McGill family. I suspect she might be Sarah McGill Russworm. But I don't have, the kind of hard evidence for that. But we know that she's a member of the McGill family.
That's incredible, though, that you've done enough research on this kind of what is probably a pretty big group of people, but that you can narrow that down and guess about families really speaks to how close you've gotten to these records and these sources in your research. Wow.
Yeah. And one of the things that we can do as historians, right, is look at other sources produced alongside the source we're looking at. And that's exactly how you do that kind of work.
Yeah. Wow. Well, as a 20th century historian, the kind of research that I do in the archives is sifting through thousands and thousands and thousands of documents, looking for kind of the smoking gun or the one shining example or the best example. And so when you are studying an earlier period, the kind of archival mystery solving that you do is so different too. And it's really neat to see how you can use objects and visual things to piece together that story too.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned is really interesting, right, about this issue of sources. So for sources produced by African Americans, yes, it can be a lot of digging and tricky, but there certainly were lots of sources written about Liberian colonization from the perspective of either abolitionists or pro-slavery forces or colonizationist forces in the US. So I'll share with you the image of the cart of books that I was looking at the library company, which took me over a month to get through. Wow. So these were publications from the American Colonization Society, and I spent a great deal of time with them. Mainly I was interested in how they were talking about Africans in the African continent, in looking at these sources, but each one of those volumes is about 400 pages.
Wow.
So we also, even in the 19th century, people loved to print things in the 19th century. This is the age of cheap print, right? With the Industrial Revolution, you get faster printing, commercial bookbinding, print gets cheaper, and early Americans have a lot to say.
They do indeed. Well, Dr. Stango, we are so lucky to have you at ISU bringing this, all this hard work and really interesting work that you've been doing out in the archive and in your writing, bringing that back to us here in the classrooms and for our students and for us in the history department. We kind of really benefit from the kind of scholarship you do. But before we let you go, I wanted to know, where can students learn a little bit more about this with you in the coming semesters?
Yeah, so I'm teaching a brand new course in the fall, African American History, and the course number is 4428. If you're a grad student, it's 5528. The course title again is African American History, and we'll dive more deeply into topics like this one. And that class will be both in seat in Pocatello and live online in Zoom. So you can be anywhere and Zoom into class, during our class time twice a week and join in on the conversation.
Great. Well, we look forward to seeing you in the classroom, and thanks again for taking the time with us.
Thanks.
See ya.